Hi everyone. It's just hit 10 o'clock, so we'll get started. I'll share my screen. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the keys to regulation for embedded networks. My name's Alex Silcock and I'm a lawyer for Law Quarter and also do some regulatory work with Compliance Quarter, where we mainly provide legal and regulatory advice for a range of different energy companies. We also use our own software systems to help energy companies comply, and through Law Quarter we've also automated contract drafting and working on natural language processing systems to use that technology for contract review. So today, this webinar will probably go for about 30 minutes with the opportunity for some questions at the end. And I am mainly going to focus on the upcoming regulatory changes for embedded networks in the work that the AEMC is currently doing in light of their review into embedded networks. I guess it's also worth mentioning that the subject of embedded networks has become more politicised in recent months, I guess, with the Labor government in Victoria and the Liberal government in New South Wales having both made announcements in relation to limiting lengths for contracts with DNOs in residential strata. But as yet, we don't have too much detail on these. But yeah, today the presentation is mainly going to focus on the AMC rules and regulatory changes that we can expect over the next couple of years. So we'll just start with a brief overview. Most of you guys listening would obviously know what an embedded network is, but we'll start off with the definition that's found in the National Electricity Rules. So an embedded network, as defined in the rules, is a distribution system connected at a parent connection point to either a distribution system or transmission system that forms part of the national grid, and which is owned, controlled, or operated by a person who is not a network service provider. So essentially, it's its own mini network that is still connected to the grid at a parent connection point or a gate meter. And I guess the key part of that definition is that it's operated by a person who's not a network service provider. And a network service provider is a distribution system, essentially. So I guess it's appropriate to note here that one of the upcoming changes will mean that this term embedded network will be similarly defined in the National Energy Retail Law, which it hasn't been up until this point, aside from a few references to exempt seller. That term, the actual term embedded network, doesn't have a definition in the retail law. So these zones, separate smaller embedded networks, they're commonly in residential or commercial strata, some retirement villages, manufactured housing and shopping centres. So essentially what happens is an on-seller will purchase electricity from a market retailer and then sell to customers within the smaller network. So I guess we're well aware of some of the benefits of embedded networks. So the idea is that it can be a win-win situation with the bulk purchase of electricity for a lower price at the gate meter to be on-sold to residents or consumers within the embedded network for a cheaper rate than what they'd be able to get than if they were on market. But at the same time, the on-seller can also make a profit themselves. These benefits can be enhanced, obviously, with the emergence of new technologies and embedded generation and battery storage. And I guess another benefit of embedded networks traditionally has been that there's been more scope for innovation, pretty much as there's been less regulation around this up until this point, really. I guess from here on in, most of the testing of sort of different models and innovative ideas like peer-to-peer trading, for example, may have to be limited to standalone power systems or microgrids that aren't actually connected to the national grid. So despite all the benefits of embedded networks, there has been significant concern around consumer protection issues. And I guess there's two threads to this. And the first is that there's reduced obligations on exemption holders, whether that be sellers or network operators. So essentially, customers within embedded networks have less protections than on-market customers. And the second strand to this is the lack of ability of these customers to access the market. I guess one of the key tenets of retail competition is that consumers will be able to seek out the best offer possible in a competitive market. And there's been concerns that customers with embedded networks aren't able to do this as easily as they should be. So the power of choice reforms, obviously that was a whole range of different law and rule changes, but part of those was aimed at improving this second concern of customers being able to access market competition. Mainly this was through the appointment of the embedded network manager role to facilitate switching out on market. It's been in place for about a year now, I think, and it hasn't been entirely successful. And I think the regulators sort of recognise this. So here we have just a brief timeline of the regulatory change in the embedded network space. So it started off with the power of choice review. The issue was considered back then in 2012, which was only shortly after the implementation of the National Energy Retail Law itself. And I guess from there it took a little while for the actual changes to be drafted and then implemented. As I said, only a year ago. It was only a year ago that the final rules actually came into effect, and obviously in Queensland it wasn't until a couple of months ago that they the uncertainty around some inconsistencies with current state laws was resolved. I guess it's worth noting that despite these power of choice reforms, that they weren't entirely effective in terms of the switching, making it easier for customers to go on market. And it's been recognised really that this is a bit of a symptom of the fact that the AMC under the power of choice really only had the scope to change the national electricity rules, and they didn't have an ambit or wasn't within their remit to make any changes to the National Energy Retail Law or the retail rules, which are part of NECIF and are focused on consumer protection. So that's really where the deficiencies lay. So I think the AMC sort of, and the other regulators, they recognised that this would be the case, and they started consulting on and doing their review of the regulatory arrangements for embedded networks in 2017. They released their final report. From this point forward, we can expect some draft rule changes, some suggestions of how the recommendations can be codified into the legislation and rules to come out hopefully next month, with a final report in May of next year. In terms of the actual effective date of these changes, I think we can be expecting more for this to be around 2020. Just being aware of the fact that the proposed changes not only involve rule changes, but also changes to the legislation, which obviously require bills to be passed through Parliament, and then consequently adopted by all of the NECIF jurisdictions as well. So it could be quite some time before these changes come into effect. But nevertheless, it's good to be prepared for what's on the horizon. So these are a couple of diagrams taken from the AMC's report, and I guess to summarise the changes that are coming, really they're all geared towards this idea of elevating embedded networks into the national framework, so the national energy framework. So you can see on the left of the screen is the current regime, where essentially there's two tiers of regulation. You're either authorised or registered, or you're exempt from those requirements. And this means that sort of a lot of larger operators are operating under exemptions at the moment. On the right is the proposed new regime, where there'll be a sort of separate subcategory of authorization or registration. So in terms of selling energy, there'll be a specific category of retailer authorization for on-selling retailers. So that's retailers that don't purchase on the wholesale market and only sell within embedded networks. And then on the network side, they're going to create a new role in the legislation of an embedded network service provider, an ENSP. So similar to a distribution system like Ausgrid, just under lesser obligations. So from here, I'll sort of move on to examining the effect of the changes or the proposed changes on specific players in the embedded network space. So we'll start with sellers in new embedded networks. So the key phrase, and we've sort of latched onto this over the past year or so, is that any party who sells energy to a consumer in an embedded network is to hold a retailer authorization from the AER, or be exempted by the AER from holding a retailer authorization according to a narrow set of circumstances. So I guess, that last caveat there is what a lot of people have questions about in terms of what are the narrow set of circumstances. Essentially, it's going to be, a lot less common than before. So I think, they're contemplating things like short-term accommodation in caravan parks, temporary energy services, and selling to related entities on the same property and stuff like that. So it will be a lot harder to satisfy the requirements for an exemption. So this means that a lot of new embedded networks are going to require that authorization, and consequently this means that they'll be under heightened consumer protection requirements and compliance obligations, really the view seems to be that they will be required to be under the same consumer protection obligations as current authorized retailers. That's, I guess, in relation to hardship, complaints, disconnection, and stuff like that. And then there's the compliance obligations too, which I'm not sure exactly how they're going to work, but at the moment, authorised retailers are required to submit quarterly reports and breach notices and stuff like that. Secondly, there's going to be enhanced metering responsibilities for new sellers in embedded networks. So they'll be required to appoint metering coordinators for child minis. That means they're going to be connected to the market facing and discoverable. And the appointment of an E&M will be compulsory, which at the moment it has to be triggered under the exemption guideline. And the other big one for new embedded networks is there's going to be more specific information requirements on the costs, benefits, and risks of entering into a retail contract within an embedded network, and that's going to have to be provided to the customers up front. So moving on to the changes for network operators, and I guess traditionally we've seen that often the operator and the exempt cell will be the same, the same entity, or at least organisation. But the new regime seems to be sort of making this separation a bit clearer, especially if they're going to be require registrations and authorizations. So essentially, they'll require an authorization with AMO unless exempted according to a narrow set of circumstances. So this is talking about that creation of the new ENSP role. Again, the circumstances, the narrow set of circumstances are potentially if they're only supplying to large corporate entities, or the similar temporary accommodation exception, and then there's potentially others as well, but hasn't been made entirely clear yet. Similar to the on sellers in embedded networks, these ENSPs will be under heightened obligations, in terms of consumer protection. So, I guess what comes to mind here is, disconnection for non-payment, things like that. So these aren't really provided for in much detail or are left out altogether of the current network exemption guideline. So all of these obligations are going to be codified and put into the law and rules. So that means that obviously the AER has greater powers in terms of enforcement and civil penalties and everything as well. And there's also going to, they're going to implement, codify the guaranteed service level schemes for E&Os as well. So, I guess there's not much detail as to how that's going to work at the moment. But that's, could potentially mean some compensation schemes for customers if operators don't meet their minimum service requirements. So now I'm going to look at the impact on retailers that are authorised but only engaged in on-selling. So when I'll use the term authorised on-seller So yeah, I mean a business that has a full retail authorization but doesn't purchase off the wholesale market and only sells within embedded networks. This is many of our clients at Compliance Quarter. So I think one thing that they would all agree on really is that the current framework is a bit of a mess. And at the very least, when these changes do come into force, there will be increased regulatory certainty, because these authorised on sellers at the moment don't fit neatly into the current regime. So I think the first thing to note really is that those businesses that, those embedded network sellers that do have an authorization already or obtain an authorization before these changes, they're already operating at a higher standard and under greater scrutiny from the regulators. So essentially they're well prepared for what's coming down the road. At the moment, a lot of the uncertainty around their obligations is based around the fact that the National Energy Retail Law and rules are sort of, they're designed around with this tripartite relationship between retailer, customer, and distributor in mind. So obviously in the embedded networks, the customers have no direct relationship with the distributor. So that means that many of these sections in the law are unclear and often, don't even bind authorised on sellers at all in some cases. And I guess a related point is that some obligations in the National Energy Retail Law only apply to designated retailers, which essentially means the front, like the obligation to make a standing offer, which the AMC have sort of seen as, a right to receive supply no matter what. So any on-market customer has that right to receive electricity supply. Currently, under the retail law, embedded network customers don't. So this last one down the bottom here, in terms of a risk of dual obligations, when we went to the AMC workshop and we're involved in roundtable discussions, we did sort of raise this point, and it's sort of how these authorised retailers that only on sell, how they'll transition into the current regime. I guess one of the key questions we asked is that would this mean that these retailers would have to apply for a separate on-seller authorization when the changes come in? Obviously, that doesn't seem fair, as they're already operating to that higher standard. And another thing we asked is that if they did have that sort of two separate authorizations as a full retailer and a non-seller, would this mean that they would be under two distinct sets of requirements? Would they have to report on their activities as an authorised retailer and on their activities as an on-seller? And obviously, this would be pretty onerous if they were only engaged in on-selling activities. So it's hoped in December, when they release their draft rule changes, that this is something that the AMC have considered. So I guess what we do know for authorised retailers is that stuff like the obligation to make standing offers, rules around disconnection, life support will be tidied up. These will be more certain. And there's also the intention to make a price cap within embedded networks as well for authorised retailers, because at the moment, exempt sellers, obviously subject to certain state acts like caravan and residential parks legislation, which provide their own limitations on pricing. Exempt sellers under the retail exemption guideline can't charge more than the local area retailer. This doesn't apply to authorized retailers and embedded networks who can charge what they want at the moment. So yeah, another thing for them to note is that there will be the price cap at that local area retailer standing offer. That was a recommendation. It's sort of, unclear how this is going to work with the default market offer that's proposed to come in next year. So sort of the last group we'll look at is the effect on legacy embedded networks. So this is something, we get asked quite a lot. Usually goes, surely the existing embedded networks don't have to apply for a license. And the answer is no, they won't. But they also, things are going to change for them as well. And I guess the two main areas in which this is the case is AER enforcement, AER's powers in relation to enforcement, and the regulators are still focused on improving the ease of which customers can switch on market. So there's 4 broad changes that they're sort of implementing to bring these into effect. So you can see the first one up there, where there is an E&M in a legacy embedded network, child NIMIs must be issued. Child customers must be issued with NIMIs, so they'll be discoverable on MSATs. Secondly, the AER's enforcement role is going to be codified and more specific. I think this is going to allow them to take a bit more of a proactive role and investigate rather than have to wait on customer complaints. Thirdly, the enforcement options for the regulators for network exemption breaches will be more closely aligned with the powers for retail exemption breaches. So essentially at the moment, it's a civil penalty if you breach the retail exemption guideline, but strangely enough, there's no provision for civil penalties if you breach the network guideline. So they're going to tidy that up and make sure that those penalties can apply to breaches for network operators. And the last one is this idea of tidying up the network charges for when a customer goes on market. So they're going to make it a requirement that they can, NSPs can charge no more than the LNSP. So we'll consider that a bit more here, and this was when we went to the AMC Embedded Network workshop. This was something that the AMC have obviously given a lot of consideration to. They drafted a short report, and if you'd like a copy of that, we can send that on. But this diagram is taken from that report and essentially shows the 2 methods by which an embedded network customer is billed if they go on market currently. Option 1, you can see that the customer gets a single bill and the network charges are sort of are dealt with between their new market retailer and their ENSP. And option 2 is that the customer will receive an energy only bill and then a separate bill for network charges. Obviously, they've indicated that the preferred position is option 1, where the customer just receives a single bill. This creates less confusion for them, I guess. I guess the main thing that we really took from it was that, they don't want there to be 2 separate options, because this in itself is confusing. They're going to try and shift to this option 1, which means that they do need to tidy up this relationship between the market retailer supplying child connection points and the billing of network charges with the ENSP. They consulted on this, and it's probably worth reading the report. It's pretty informative. I guess they're considering creating a new role or to facilitate these agreements with market retailers and ENSPs. And this role, I think they posited that it could be undertaken by the LNSP, the local distributor. So lastly, I guess we've considered a lot of the changes related specifically to embedded networks, but given that the overarching change is that they'll be required to be authorised retailers very soon, it's also important to be aware that the effect of elevating embedded networks into the national framework means that many of the proposed changes or changes that are coming into effect for current authorised retailers will more than likely have an impact on them. I guess current exempt sellers and authorised on sellers should be looking at all these rule changes as well, and most of them will apply to them. So metering installation timeframe rules that are they've flown through the process and they're coming into effect next year. Life support changes have been in the works for a while, so they include pretty prescriptive requirements set out in the rules and information sharing. So that's obviously going to apply, and it will be helped by this new role of the ENSP. And the hardship guidelines as well. I think this is probably a good thing for these smaller embedded network sellers who they'll be required to have a hardship program in place once they become authorised. And I think the standardised wording that's proposed for hardship policies will be that'll be quite helpful for these smaller sellers. And the default market offer at the moment, it's a little bit unclear, but the detail hasn't been released yet. But essentially, if the standing offer, or if the new default offer is essentially to replace the standing offer, it is likely that the default market offer will apply to these new on-selling retailers as well. Obviously, there's another question in terms of generally available and non-generally available plans as well. But something that these embedded network service providers should be considering. So that brings us to the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer off the cuff. But if not, I'll take it on notice and shoot you through an email later today. Yeah, so we've got a question from Shane. So legacy embedded, did you say that legacy embedded networks don't need a retail license under the new rules? No, so legacy embedded networks won't need to apply for a retailer authorization. That's a question we get asked a lot, but they will be under enhanced requirements, and I think they are just definitely going to be taking a closer look from here on in, and they'll have enhanced investigative and enforcement powers. So from Alan, we have, regarding the new metering obligations for ENOs, could you briefly outline what this includes? For example, will there be a requirement for new meters to be installed? And if so, will the new power of choice rule apply, i.e. all new meters will be advanced meters. Yeah, so in terms of legacy, the answer is probably no, but for new, for new embedded networks, that's the idea. If they're under the authorized retailer obligations, then those same metering requirements will apply to them. So it'll have to be, market approved, market approved meters as far as I know. Again, we can wait until we see the draft legislation and rules next, hopefully within the next few weeks. But yeah, more than likely, the general theme is that, customers within embedded networks will have the same rights as those on market. So the metering requirements will be the same. So Rachel says, I have some confusion between the relationship between the E&O role and the new ENSP. Could you please clarify the difference? If we already have a deemed exemption for a legacy embedded network, will this change with the narrowing of exemption circumstances? So obviously, we could provide you with advice in relation to specific circumstances if you want to shoot me an email, but generally the new ENSP role will be replacing this exempt embedded network operator, the network exemption, and legacy ENOs will remain under heightened scrutiny from the AER, and like I said, they're sort of open to, they'll probably be open to civil penalties and such, but from here on in, there'll be this new role of ENSP, which is essentially like a second tier of network service provider behind the major distributors like Ausgrid and Essential and such. So I think you can probably expect in the ENSP role to at least have the same requirements as in the current exemption guideline, but also to be under some similar requirements to distributors. I think probably best to just wait for the draft legislation, but if you wanted some idea of what those requirements are, then I would suggest looking at the National Energy Retail Rules and looking at some of the obligations that apply to distributors, because they'll likely be very much the same for the new ENSP role. All right, so that looks to be it. Thanks, guys, for coming. And like I said, if something comes up, feel free to shoot me an email, and happy to look into it for you.